You never expect the stillest moments to reshape your life, but sometimes they do. The afternoon I found my steps in Thomas, absorbed in something I never anticipated, left me shaken, curious, and unexpectedly moved. What unfolded in the days that followed made me reconsider everything I thought I knew about boundaries, emotion, and the depth of human connection, something I never imagined experiencing again at my age. Before I unfold the rest of this night, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It really does help more than you know, and if you're drawn into stories like this, I want you here for every one of them. Also tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Are you in a small town where the evenings fall slow and gentle, or in a city where the lights never quite go dark? I had just finished straightening up the kitchen, the late afternoon light casting long amber streaks across the tile floor. It was one of those rare, hushed days when the house seemed to hold its breath. Thomas had been unusually quiet all morning, headphones on, hunched over his desk, tapping away at something I couldn't see. Normally, he'd wander in to chat about work, share some offbeat theory he'd read about, or simply keep me company while I cooked. But today, nothing. He barely glanced up when I passed his door. I was about to call out to him, ask if he wanted some tea, when I noticed the door to the study was slightly ajar. Thomas never left it wide open, but something about the way the light fell through the gap made me pause. There was a kind of intimacy in the way shadows played on the floor. I caught myself hesitating at the threshold, an unusual hesitation that made me wonder why. Curiosity, I suppose, got the better of me. I stepped closer and, without thinking, peered inside. Thomas was there, seated at his desk, facing the window. The warm afternoon glow brushed over his shoulders. He wasn't doing anything alarming, nothing that would justify my hovering, but he was humming softly, completely absorbed in a small, intricate project before him. It was a detailed clockwork mechanism, gears and springs and tiny brass fittings, each piece carefully positioned with precision tweezers. The delicate parts gleamed under his focused attention. I froze. I had been expecting something else entirely, something dramatic, maybe something that would explain my lingering. But instead it was this quiet, meticulous devotion to creating something beautiful. My stepson, sitting alone, completely focused, lost in his own world. I don't know why, but the sight of him like this stirred something in me, an admiration, a tenderness I hadn't anticipated. I cleared my throat softly, trying not to startle him. Thomas looked up, surprised at first, but then relaxed when he saw me in the doorway. "Hey, Margaret," he said, his voice carrying that familiar awkward warmth I had always liked about him. "I didn't hear you come in." "It's okay," I said, stepping fully into the room. "I didn't realize you were working on that. It looks incredible." My voice was softer than I intended, almost reverent. He smiled a little sheepishly and held up a tiny brass gear for me to see. "Thanks, I've been at it for hours. It's kind of therapeutic." I moved closer, drawn to the meticulous craftsmanship. I noticed how his hands moved with a kind of care that only comes from truly loving what you're doing. There was a pause, a stillness in the room. The only sounds were the ticking of a distant clock and the soft hum of music playing from his laptop. It was intimate, not in any inappropriate sense, but in a way that made the air feel charged, like we were sharing a secret. "Thomas," I said quietly, sitting on the edge of a nearby chair, careful not to invade his space too much. "I never realized you could do this. It's beautiful." He looked at me, and there was a flicker of something, surprise maybe, or vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't usually show it to anyone," he admitted, his voice low. "I like doing it alone, but I guess I wanted to share it with someone this time." Something about the honesty in his tone struck me. Here was a man I'd watched grow up, someone I thought I knew inside and out, revealing a side of himself I had never seen. And it wasn't just the clockwork. It was the trust, the willingness to let me into a part of his world that was deeply personal. "I'm glad you did," I whispered. My heart felt unusually full, not in a troubling way, but in a way that made me aware of the fragility of moments like this. There's a rare kind of closeness that only comes when someone allows you to see them, really see them, without pretense. Thomas's fingers paused over the next piece, and he looked at me in a way that made me catch my breath. There was a silent understanding between us, a mutual recognition that this moment, this unexpected sharing, was more meaningful than either of us could put into words. We didn't speak for a long time after that. We simply watched the light move across the room, the tiny mechanism slowly taking shape. And in that quiet, I realized something about connection, about the way people can surprise you at any age. The afternoon sun was fading, but the warmth in that room, the unspoken bond, lingered. It filled the space with something fragile, tender, and unforgettable. It wasn't about shock or drama, like so many stories try to be. It was about noticing, about being present, about recognizing a moment of pure humanity in someone you love. And in that recognition, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, something like awe, gratitude, and yes, connection. By the time I left the room, Thomas had gone back to his work, humming softly again. But the atmosphere had shifted. I knew that neither of us would forget this quiet afternoon, this unexpected glimpse into a part of his life that was his alone, and yet somehow now also ours. I stepped into the hallway, closing the door gently behind me. And for the first time that day, I allowed myself a small, contented smile. Some moments, brief, silent, and profound, stay with you longer than anything else. This was one of those moments. After that quiet afternoon, I found myself thinking about Thomas more than usual. Not in any inappropriate way, just noticing him. The way he moved through the house. The small details that usually escaped me. The way he made his morning coffee. The way he hummed under his breath when he was concentrating. The little sighs he let out when a piece didn't fit right. These small moments, so ordinary, suddenly felt profound. The next morning, I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when I heard him in the living room, softly clearing his throat. I looked up to see him standing there, holding one of the tiny brass gears from the day before. "I thought you might want to see how the bass turned out overnight," he said, his voice tentative, almost shy. I smiled, stepping closer. "I'd love that, Thomas. Thank you." He placed the piece on the table gently, almost reverently, and I realized I was watching him more closely than ever before. There was something about the care with which he handled the mechanism. The attention in his eyes. It reminded me of watching my own children when they were young, fully absorbed in something they loved. But seeing it now in Thomas, as a man in his 30s, it had a different effect. A mix of admiration and tenderness. An emotional pull I hadn't anticipated. 2. We spent the morning together in a way that felt both ordinary and intimate. He worked on his clockwork, and I worked in the kitchen. But every so often, our hands would brush when passing materials or exchanging small tools. Nothing overt, nothing charged, but the awareness between us was undeniable. We were both conscious of the presence, the closeness, and yet, respectfully, neither of us overstepped. At one point, Thomas set down a tiny, almost completed gear and looked at me, his eyes soft. "You know, I never really talk about this with anyone. My friends wouldn't get it. They'd probably just tease me or roll their eyes. But with you, it's different." I felt warmth spread across my chest. "I'm glad you feel that way," I said. "It's nice to be trusted like that, to see something personal and real." He smiled, almost shyly, and returned to his work. I couldn't help but notice the way the afternoon light fell on his hair, the subtle movements of his hands, the soft concentration in his expression. It was mesmerizing in its simplicity, and I felt a stirring of emotions I hadn't expected: admiration, protectiveness, and a deep sense of connection. Later, he invited me to sit with him at the table. "I know it might seem silly," he said, "but would you like to help? Just a little?" I hesitated, then nodded. "I'd love to." He handed me a tiny piece, and we began fitting it into place together. Our hands touched occasionally, lightly, and each time, there was a spark of unspoken recognition. An awareness of closeness that was delicate, respectful, and deeply human. We laughed softly when something didn't fit, teasing each other in a way that felt playful and genuine. At one point, Thomas leaned back, his shoulders relaxing. I realized how much tension he must have been holding in. Watching him like that, feeling the quiet intimacy of our shared activity, I found myself drawn in completely, not in a romantic or inappropriate sense, but in the sense of being emotionally connected, present, attentive to someone who trusted me completely. "You know, Margaret," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant, "I don't usually let people in like this. I mean really in." "I can see that," I replied gently, "and I feel honored that you're letting me." There was a pause. The kind that happens when words aren't necessary, when presence is enough. The light had shifted in the room. The afternoon sun was fading, casting a warm golden glow across the table. Shadows stretched across the floor, highlighting the tiny mechanism we were building together. And in that moment, I realized just how profound simple connection could be. The kind that doesn't need labels. The kind that thrives on trust, attention, and shared experience. As the evening approached, we continued working quietly. Thomas would hand me pieces and I'd fit them carefully into place. Occasionally, he'd correct my placement, not impatiently, but with gentle guidance, and I appreciated the care he showed. It wasn't just about the clockwork. It was about the collaboration, the attention, the mutual respect that allowed us to share this intimate space. At one point, I looked up and caught his gaze. There was a flicker of something, gratitude maybe, or admiration. I smiled softly, letting him know I understood. No words were needed. Eventually, he set down his tools and leaned back, stretching his arms over his head. "I think we've made real progress today," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. I nodded, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. "We really have. It's beautiful, Thomas, and I've really enjoyed this." He smiled, and for a moment we simply sat there, two people sharing a quiet, meaningful connection in a world that often moves too fast to notice moments like this. As I got up to leave, I felt a strange mix of emotions: contentment, wonder, and a subtle ache that such moments were fleeting. But I also felt grateful. Grateful that Thomas had trusted me, that he had shared this part of himself, that we had discovered a connection that transcended words and expectations. Walking down the hallway, I glanced back at him, still focused on his work. I realized that moments like these, unexpected, quiet, and deeply human, could leave a lasting impression. They remind you of the power of trust, of presence, of emotional connection that doesn't need to be defined or explained. That evening, I went to bed feeling a mixture of reflection and anticipation. I wondered what tomorrow would bring, whether we would continue this unspoken ritual, this delicate dance of closeness and understanding. I didn't know, and perhaps that was the beauty of it, not knowing, just being present, just being trusted. And somehow that trust, that quiet intimacy, felt more significant than anything else, too. The next few days passed in a kind of gentle rhythm, a quiet pattern that neither of us disrupted. Thomas would retreat to the study in the afternoons, and I would go about my tasks. Yet there was an unspoken understanding between us, a subtle tension that threaded through the house like sunlight through blinds. It wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It was more like the anticipation of a conversation you know will be meaningful, but you don't yet know exactly how it will unfold. One afternoon, I found myself drawn to the study again, almost against my own reasoning. I wasn't trying to intrude. I just wanted to be near him, to see him, to share the quiet energy that had begun to settle between us. When I opened the door, he looked up, surprised but smiling, that familiar mixture of shyness and warmth I had come to recognize. "Margaret," he said softly, "you're here again." I chuckled lightly, stepping into the room. "I just wanted to see how the project was coming along, and I suppose to spend a few moments with you." His gaze lingered for a moment, and there was something in his expression that made my heart thrum with an odd mix of awareness and emotion. "Well, in that case, I'm glad you came." He moved aside to let me sit, and I found myself perched at the edge of the desk, watching his hands as they worked. Each motion was deliberate, careful, almost meditative. I realized I was learning something about him I had never seen before. How meticulous he could be. How absorbed he became in creation. How vulnerable he allowed himself to be in the presence of someone he trusted. "Do you know," I said quietly, "I never realized how calming this is. Just watching you work, seeing the care you put into it. There's something very peaceful about it." Thomas paused, holding a tiny piece between his fingers, and looked at me thoughtfully. "I didn't think anyone would notice that," he said. "Most people just see me as busy, distracted, or too serious." "You're none of those things," I replied gently. "I see more than that. I see the part of you that's patient, attentive, honest, and I think it's beautiful." He looked at me, and for a moment I thought he might say something more. But instead, he smiled softly and returned to his work. There was a tension in the room, subtle but unmistakable. The kind that exists when two people share a space so closely that words become unnecessary. At one point, he set down a tiny piece and leaned back, stretching his arms over his head. "You know, Margaret," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "It's strange. I don't usually let people in, not like this, but with you it feels safe, comfortable." I nodded, understanding the depth behind his words. "I feel the same way," I admitted. "It's rare to find someone you can just be with, without pretense, without expectations. And I think that's what makes this so special." We continued in silence for a while, the quiet broken only by the faint hum of the air and the soft tap of his tools. The afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the desk, highlighting the intricate details of the mechanism. I realized that in these moments the world outside didn't exist. There was only this, us, the project, and the delicate tension of trust and connection. Then, unexpectedly, Thomas reached out, lightly touching my hand as he passed me a tiny tool. The contact was brief, almost fleeting, but it sent a shiver of awareness through me. Not shock, not fear, just recognition. Recognition of closeness, of shared vulnerability, of trust. I looked into his eyes and I saw the same understanding mirrored there. "You're really good at this," he said softly. Not about the mechanism, but about the way we were working together. The care and attention I had brought into his world. I smiled, feeling warmth spread through me. I think it's because you make it easy to care. You make it feel natural and safe. There was a pause. I could feel the tension in the air, subtle and electric. A quiet acknowledgement of something unspoken, and yet neither of us crossed any line. Because the moment wasn't about desire or temptation. It was about recognition. About the fragile, profound intimacy of trust. As the afternoon waned, Thomas leaned back, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. "I think this might be the best it's ever looked," he said. I glanced at the mechanism and nodded. "It's remarkable. And I think, more than that, it's the time we've shared that makes it special." He looked at me, and I caught that flicker of vulnerability again. That subtle openness that made my heart ache in the most gentle way. "I'm glad you're here, Margaret. Truly glad." I reached out and lightly touched his arm, a simple gesture of reassurance and acknowledgement. "Me too, Thomas. Me too." We stayed like that for a while, just sitting, the afternoon light fading into evening. The quiet intimacy of shared space settling around us like a gentle blanket. I realized something in that moment. This wasn't about romance or drama or any of the things that make life complicated. It was about being present, about noticing, about sharing a part of oneself that is rare and precious. As I finally rose to leave, Thomas spoke again, softly, almost hesitant. "Will you be here tomorrow?" I smiled, feeling a warmth that went beyond the simple words. "Yes, I'll be here." And with that, I stepped out of the study, closing the door gently behind me. The house was quiet again, but the echoes of that afternoon, the soft laughter, the careful movements, the shared moments of understanding, lingered in the air. A reminder that connection, even unexpected and subtle, can leave a lasting impression. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how unusual it was to feel such closeness, such trust, with someone I had considered family in a different sense. But it wasn't complicated. It wasn't improper. It was human. It was awareness, attention, and respect. And I knew that those quiet afternoons with Thomas, building something together, sharing something meaningful, were going to stay with me long after the pieces were complete. I drifted off to sleep with a smile, thinking about the next day, about the gentle rhythm we had found, and about how rare and beautiful it was to be truly seen and to see someone else in this way. The final morning arrived with a soft, golden light. When I entered the study, Thomas was already there, the mechanism nearly complete. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, catching on the polished brass and casting miniature reflections across the walls. I paused at the doorway, taking a moment to simply watch him. There was a focus in his expression, a gentle intensity that made me feel both proud and deeply connected. "Margaret," he said, looking up with a faint smile. "I didn't think I'd finish this today, but here we are." I stepped closer, drawn by the quiet pride in his voice. "It's beautiful, Thomas. Every detail, it's perfect." He set down the final piece, leaning back in his chair with a sigh of relief and satisfaction. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted. "Honestly, you made it easier, lighter, somehow more meaningful." I felt warmth rise to my cheeks. "I didn't do much," I said softly. "I just shared the space with you. That's all." But I knew it wasn't just that. The mechanism was more than metal and springs. It was a testament to patience, care, and shared attention. And the hours we had spent together had left something deeper in the room, a sense of understanding and trust that neither of us had anticipated. For a moment, we simply looked at the finished piece. And then, almost instinctively, I reached out to run my fingers along one of the gears, marveling at the precision. Thomas's hand brushed against mine lightly, and I felt that familiar shiver of awareness, the subtle acknowledgement of closeness that had threaded through the past few days. "You know," he said quietly, "I've never really had anyone watch me do something like this before. Not with patience. Not with appreciation. You've earned it," I said, feeling the truth in my voice. "And you deserve someone to notice, to value the care you put into things. It's rare, but it's worth it." He smiled and the room felt softer, warmer, filled with a quiet intimacy that didn't need words. We didn't speak for a long time, simply sharing that space, that presence. There was no awkwardness, no pressure, just the kind of connection that leaves you quietly changed. Finally, he leaned back and said something that made me pause. "I think I've learned something these past few days." "Oh," I asked, curious. "That it's okay to let someone in," he said, his voice steady but tender. "To share a part of yourself, even the quiet, private parts. I'd always thought I had to handle everything alone. But having you here, noticing, caring, it makes it different, better." I felt a lump in my throat. "I think I've learned the same thing," I admitted. "It's rare to feel seen like that, and even rarer to trust someone enough to let them in. But now, I understand what it means. We sat in silence again, the sunlight fading, casting long shadows across the desk. The mechanism stood complete between us, a symbol of our shared moments, of patience, trust, and subtle emotional intimacy. Then, in a gentle, almost playful tone, Thomas said, "I don't want this to end. Tomorrow, or the day after, or the next. I like this. Us, like this." I smiled, warmth spreading through me. "Neither do I, Thomas. Neither do I." There was no need for anything more than that. The words had said everything we needed. It wasn't about crossing boundaries or changing our lives in dramatic ways. It was about presence, attention, and the quiet but profound connection that comes when two people allow themselves to be truly seen and understood. As evening approached, I stood, stretching lightly, feeling a sense of calm satisfaction. "I should get going," I said softly. "But thank you for letting me be here, for sharing this with me." He nodded, and in that look there was gratitude, trust, and something unspoken but deeply understood. "Thank you," he replied simply, "for noticing, for being here." Walking out of the study, I realized that this experience, unexpected, quiet, yet profoundly moving, had changed something in me. I had been reminded of the beauty in patience, in attention, in shared moments that require nothing more than presence. I had learned that trust, even in small doses, could create intimacy far more powerful than words or grand gestures ever could. Later that evening, as I sat quietly in the living room, I reflected on the past days. The afternoons spent in the study, the shared smiles, the gentle touches, the quiet conversations. I understood now that what had mattered most wasn't the mechanism, or even the time spent. It was the trust, the emotional closeness, the ability to see and be seen. I thought about Thomas, about the careful attention he had shown, the patience he had brought, the subtle ways he had allowed me into his world. And I knew that these moments, fragile and fleeting as they might seem, were lasting. They were the kind of experiences that stay with you, quietly shaping how you see people, how you understand connection, and how you value the simple, profound act of being present. As I prepared for bed, I smiled softly, thinking about the mechanism sitting on the desk, a symbol of something much greater than metal and gears. It was a symbol of connection, trust, and shared humanity. And as I drifted off to sleep, I felt a quiet sense of gratitude for the unexpected intimacy, the shared discovery, and the realization that meaningful connections can happen at any age, in any place, when two people are willing to truly see each other. Sometimes the most profound experiences are not loud or dramatic. Sometimes they're quiet, simple, and deeply human. And sometimes they leave a mark that lasts far longer than we could ever anticipate.